Thank you very much for joining me in the Janice Oasis. Today I have Dr. Autumn Thomas, who is from Denver, Colorado, and she is the founder of Mud and Lotus Consulting, and she's a human systems analyst. And so she works with companies to create restorative conversations and practices that help employees relate better to each other and really help the businesses thrive in a period of extreme change. Did I capture everything?
Yes, you did. Thank you. Thank you, Nola. I'm so glad to be here. I love your podcast. I love all of your episodes. They're so great. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, you're quite welcome. I was telling her earlier that it's really challenging to get positive feedback or any kind of feedback, really. So to actually get feedback directly on the podcast is perfect. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I definitely have some books I'll be purchasing.
Oh, I know. Yeah, exactly. And it's funny because I find I know so many people who write books now, and it's just, okay, I read a book and I'm like, I really like what they're saying, or there's aspects of the book that I really want to ask more questions about. And it's like, cool, let's ask them if they can get on the podcast. And so it's creating this whole curated list of resources that I can actually put in my community as well too. And so that's cool. Somebody who's doing their master's told me that I had a playlist or a book list, like unlike anybody else. And I was like, oh, that's kind of cool.
So. Yeah, I think you're out there trying to advocate for that individualized work space and humanized work system. So I think that's something that's very appealing.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. And that's where I've been attracted to the work that you do. Autumn and I actually met in a networking group earlier this year. And right from the beginning, even just like the intro call, it was just like, we have some things that we should really talk about. So this conversation has been a few months in the making. But Autumn really works with companies who they have relationships that have degraded, or they want to make sure that they've got a really positive, healthy culture, and they bring her in to make sure that they've got safe spaces, they've got agreements in place for how people want to work. And given everything that's been going on in the political climate in the US, I think that her services have never been in more demand. And really, the crux of the matter is right now is like, how do you continue to work? How do you continue to operate a company that's going to be productive, that's going to allow you to support your employees, make them feel seen and heard, but not necessarily wade into the details of the politics, which may be outside of your scope of expertise. And that's where, Autumn, do you have some insights for companies that are actually struggling with what's been going on in the last few months? It's been a very challenging few months.
Yeah, a few months and few years. And I think we've gone to some different extremes in businesses, and we've been learning a lot. All of the different businesses are learning a lot. And I look at it from a human systems perspective, something more, how does the system operate? What is the system actually putting out there as its values? What are the results of the system operating? Because even a dysfunctional system usually has an output. It might not be what the system would like it to be. And so now we're walking into this political turmoil in multiple systems, and systems are being put to the test at the most extreme level, I believe. And their policies are coming into question. Their way that they operate is coming into question. They've had to adapt through COVID, and then also really start to challenge their own thinking when it comes to equity and what does diversity look like? What does inclusion really look like? And there is no right or wrong answer. Or I'd say there are some wrong answers, but there hasn't really been a label for the right answer. So now we're walking into more upheaval, and people are disconnected, and the vibe is off. And you were talking about someone you spoke to, but the vibe is off. And the big thing that I'm noticing that organizations are struggling with is, if you adopt one view, you alienate someone else. So as leadership, a lot of leaders are trained and understand and know this, that they try to stay very neutral. They try to stay very much in the middle. If you adopt a view, then you can alienate someone else. And then that could cause a disruption in your workforce, and that can cause fissures in relationships. So I love restorative practices in this way, that it's a conversation where we focus on when people are having an incident or a problem, and we focus on that moment. We can bring two people together, or we can do a whole corporate circle where we say what happened and we talk about the impact, maybe. So if it is a political conversation at work, we might want to say, what's the impact that that conversation is having on people? And you're usually surprised. Some people will say stuff that you didn't think of. That's how it was impacting them. Maybe they support the person who spoke out in one way, or maybe they don't support, but their impact on what they see, how it affected them, is a surprise sometimes for the rest of the group. And they have to decide, okay, now that we know how we're impacting each other, what agreements or guidelines do we need to move forward? So it's a very forward focused group, and leadership has to hear some of the stuff that they don't want to hear too. And they have to say, okay, we're going to try to make this agreement. We're going to try to follow it. And then we have to revisit it in a few months or so, just to see if it's really a feasible agreement and if it's possible. And that's how you'll create the flexibility in your organization to roll with these very dramatic and hard changes. And the big feelings that people are walking in with, because they might want to have those difficult political conversations in a circle, and we can't. An organization can't take a political stance unless it's a political organization or a nonprofit or some kind of organization that's actually working towards that political goal. But a small business generally is doing its best just to survive and keep profitable. And if people are walking in and they're having these disagreements on a daily basis, then the repair work has to happen so that they can say, okay, we have to sometimes separate our work life from our political or personal life. And we have to find a way to make an agreement to move forward. And some people will self-select and say, I won't stay under these conditions. That does happen. But if you're opening the door to the conversations, people have more and more faith and loyalty towards the organization, because they feel like at least they get a chance to express and be heard for what they need.
That's actually something that I noticed you talking about, is like one of the impacts that you disclose to companies when you come in is, when I do this work, sometimes people will leave, right? That's an impact you should actually be prepared about, because if it's a toxic environment, sometimes there's one or two people who are actually creating the problems, and a lot of the drama stems from those one or two people. And you've had success where you've actually managed to work with those individuals and change their mindsets and work with them so that they actually even become strong advocates of the change that you're trying to implement. But then you've also seen people actually leave too.
Yeah. And it's inspiring when someone says, wow, I feel the shift in me towards, because the behavior, I'm working with an organization right now, and I'm doing some interviews, I'm doing some pre-circles, and I can feel and hear, and it's always the same story. There are some people who are there, and they're stuck in this past moment where something went wrong and no one ever fixed it. And I can't go back to the past and fix a moment in the past, but the feeling and the behaviors are still manifesting in the present. So I focus on the present, and then I say, what agreements can we make to move forward? And that's when that kind of stuff comes out. They'll say, I need from now on this one thing that happened way back here to never happen again. And then they get a chance to sort of put that out there. Maybe a boundary violation occurred way back when, and they're like, okay, so now I need that to always be something that never happens again. And then the community has a conversation about it and says, okay, so is this possible? Are we going to be able to never have somebody assume negative, or never have a person yell? One time someone said, I got yelled at once 3 years ago by this guy who is the marketing manager. He yelled at me and it hurt, and I'll never forget that. And I need someone to never yell at me again. And then we get to this space. Well, is that possible? What's the real agreement we need? The real agreement that we need is that people are going to be mindful of their volume as much as they possibly can. And then we're going to give people the tools for when someone feels like they're being yelled at, to say, oh, hold on, I feel like I'm being yelled at. Can we put a pause on this? Can we put a pin in this conversation and maybe talk about it later? So we start to do some skill development when it comes to the agreements, so that this past trauma, I would call it, starts to become coped with, dealt with, and without having to go back and have this conference with the two people or a mediation, it actually becomes a whole holistic approach. The problem when I walk in with people who are sometimes defined as toxic, and I say people who are toxic are also people, right? And they've been operating at a certain level for a very long time, and it's been meeting some type of need that they've had, or they have learned to navigate it at a high level, right? Maybe they've learned to navigate some of the negative stuff, and they've learned maybe to manipulate other people, and learned how to maybe be passive aggressive to get the things that they want. And they've learned that if they do it this way, they'll get that person to do the
They're
thing.
adapting to an environment. I've had this conversation about boiling frogs. I had this conversation last week about boiling frogs, and it came up today again too in cartoons and LinkedIn. So I don't know if you know the story, but so basically there was a whole scientific experiment, which hopefully wouldn't be allowed these days, but probably would be. It was basically like if you put frogs in water and then you start to heat the water, you would expect that they would jump out, but they don't. They adapt until they actually boil to death, which is disgusting. But that's
Yeah.
essentially that sort of environment metaphor, is like you adapt to the metaphor where these behaviors are allowed.
Yes.
So
I love that analogy, because that is exactly like they have learned to adapt and they might be the most resilient people. So to call them toxic might be, but they're pretty resilient because they're usually people who've lasted a very long time, and they have figured out how to work all of the stuff, and they function at that level, and they are used to it, and it makes them comfortable and safe because they have navigated it very well. They're very comfortable at a certain level, even though they do complain a lot because they're upset and they don't like it. But what I find is that when the culture starts to shift with restorative practices, if you're doing the restore and the repair work, there's a lot of doubt to start. I get called in a lot of times at the last second. Everything's falling apart. Oh my gosh, we don't know what to do. I'm the last resort, and they've already tried a lot of things. So when I come in, they're like, "Oh, we've done this. We had this one guy do it. And I'm like, okay, that's okay. I can't guarantee that everything's going to be wonderful. This is not restoring and repairing is not making up and hugging and saying, oh, we're friends now. No, it's just about agreements to move forward. And we can't be stuck in this quagmire, and we're trying to get out of it, and we have to figure it out. And it's about a collaboration between leadership and employees hitting agreements and holding each other accountable. And those even become policies, right? They become real spoken policies, and they align with the vision, they align with the values. And that's when your system begins to start to purge almost things that just don't align with those very strong agreements. And if it goes unmonitored, if a system goes unmonitored, it does turn toxic. It does. It happens. I've walked into systems where illegal stuff, with things were just horrendous and really good people. And that's how I got into systems theory. Was a social worker told me there's this theory about systems, and if there was let's say a treatment center for people who have mental illness, right? And if people with this mental illness go into the treatment center, all the people taking care of the people with the mental illness are good-hearted people who are trying their best to serve the people who have the mental illness and help them create a plan for themselves, help them get healthier in the level that they want, self-actualize to the point that they want to. But what happens is sometimes these people with the mental illness have a lot of trauma, and they start to trigger their healthcare, their providers, right? The people who are helping them. And then those people sometimes might start to behave in ways that they had never seen themselves behave, and start to punish or withhold or do things with the people who have the mental illness, the people they're trying to take care of. So if there's no checks and balances within that system, then that system can become abusive to the people who are actually coming in to get help. And people who see themselves as really good people might behave in ways that they feel terrible about later when they leave the system, but they don't realize that there's these pressures, because then there's the peer pressures. Then there's the person who says, I knew it this way and I get away with it. All these little things start to happen. And that's really why when I walk into systems, I don't take anything personally, because I see it as a human kind of, sometimes a human system going unchecked And so what I am hopeful of is what a leader calls me in and says, we need help. We've been trying everything. And I said, great. I'm glad that the leaders are still ready to try something new, because if they're not, that the system just goes unchecked and it will function. Like they say, oh, it's a dysfunctional system. It's functioning on some level,
Yeah.
and or else it disintegrates. A system doesn't exist if it doesn't function. It's done. So when I'm training, so that's a different side of what I do too. So I have different packages and they go in different ways. So my big one, the one that's, oh my gosh, we're dying, we need help, is the one where I can go in and interview each person. And when I interview each person, I interview them with balanced inquiry, which is I ask questions and then I repeat back what they're saying. I do a lot of paraphrasing. I do a lot of this coaching model of interviewing where I'm also bouncing back what they're thinking so that I'm a mirror for them and saying, and that's how I take myself out. And I do that when I do a smaller group situation where they're saying, okay, we just want you to come in and do some circles with us. And for me, that's a little bit less, I don't like doing that as much, but I will because I know it's necessary. And when people see the circle in action, a lot of times I go, oh, wow, we love this, because that does where I bounce back their thinking. And what I train people in once I get in and I get into like management and I get into they'll ask me, can you train us how to do this stuff? And I'll say, yes, because that's really my goal. My ultimate goal is not just to fix and repair spaces, but to train people to do it themselves. That's why I became a consultant. I want to spread this to everybody. And when we run into a situation like that, I teach them how to challenge their own thinking, because that's The Fifth Discipline by Peter Senge is an amazing book on systems thinking. And in there, he talks about balanced inquiry. He talks about challenging mental models, challenging your own thinking. And if you get into a habit of making sure other people are able to ask you questions or questioning others and then bouncing back what you're hearing, you can get into this communication style where you are noticing something might be wrong, right? So your friend, your coworker or whatnot might have a problem. And then you might be able to find a systemic answer to that problem or a personal one-on-one answer to that problem. And I think for me personally, like, for example, when I walked into, I was telling you, a very detrimental system, the only thing that got me through that, because I did have to put a stop to some very serious things, but they've been going on for years. Those things had been happening for years because of the system. I didn't take it personally that people were mad at me for stopping it. I didn't take it personally that people were frustrated that they weren't going to be able to get away with behaviors that they had gone away with. I was just like, this is just how the system operates. But the only way I could personally stand that fire was my own core values. And so a system that has the core value of taking care of its people, and it keeps reorienting to workforce retention. If that's a value, they really value their people and they really want to train them to be the most excellent, they're going to want the trainings like I offer, or other people offer, where they learn to do inquiry with each other. They learn to challenge their thinking. They learn to not get stuck in a certain space where they can't get out, because that's one of the hardest things with depression, suicide, and all the stuff that is so heartbreaking, is that there's a lot of stuckness in their mind, in a mental model that isn't being challenged by anybody. And they've done a great job of being stoic and building boundaries and putting themselves in a space where no one can penetrate through and be a support for them, because that's also our society. I know in US, our society is very individualistic and very stoic and you take care of you do it, you follow it.
It's a stigma too, if you can't do that, right?
Yes. And it's a stigma in where if you rely too much on someone else, also they might manipulate you, or they might do harm, or there's all these different things. But if people are trained in communication techniques that support asking a lot of questions and really hearing it and repeating it back purposefully, mindfully, like in the moment, then you can start to slow it down. And a system does help, because the system if that's a value of the system, then people start to behave that way. And that's why, when going back to the toxic person, that's why when the system starts to transform and all of a sudden there's this pressure from the system to move on from the past. There's pressure from the system to let go of some stuff that has happened. And now we acknowledge it happened. We do validate all of that. But now we're going to say, okay, we acknowledge all of that. We've done the hard work to have these conversations that were very uncomfortable, difficult. We've come to some agreements. We've worked on them. We've revisited those agreements. And our train is moving in the right direction. We've pulled ourselves out of the quagmire. We're starting to see the light. And then the pressure of the system now becomes, we're a human system and we care about humanity. We care about each other. We listen to each other. And now we're a supportive space. Some people don't function well in that. They're like, I don't like this, isn't good. Or maybe
it's a resistance to change too, because
or maybe they see they need to change and they say, man, I need to change, but I don't want to do it with these people around me because they've seen me at my worst. So I'm going to go somewhere else where I can be at my best. It's not always the worst thing that they're going to walk into another space.
Yeah, exactly. I see that with hybrid and remote as well too. Like there's just such a change that's happening, and they've always thrived with being in person, for example, and they really value being in the office. And so if the organization is switching over to a different way of working, it really undermines their narratives about what made them successful throughout their career. So sometimes it's the narrative, the personal narrative, that they don't want to retell that story in a different way. So they're going to take that story somewhere else.
Right. And and even in hybrid, I was the person that you would meet in the break room and you would tell all your stuff to, and I was the mama bear or the papa bear of the whole place, and I took care of people. Now I don't
party planner.
Yeah, I was the party planner. Now I don't, and that's okay because maybe they thrive more in person anyway. And that's really what I love about what you're doing, is that you're basically saying like it's a differentiated approach. And I was an educator for years with classroom teacher, and that was our approach as teachers. We wanted to differentiate for each student so they could thrive. And that's what we need to be doing in our workforce. And I do see restorative practices as a pathway to that, because when we have these conversations, people get to express their needs, and it isn't that the next day those needs get met. It's a process to revisit and say, okay. An example was one group that I was leading said, we want to have a go to the person policy. We don't want any more talking behind each other's backs. And that is true. That happens we want us to go to the person. It turns out that was a lot harder than they thought, because then when something happened with a person, they were like, oh, I don't want to go talk to that person. I'm afraid of what might happen if I talk to that. I don't know what their reaction is going to be. Oh gosh. So they switched that agreement when we revisited to, okay, I'm going to go to a peer, and we're going to actually have a process on how to go to the person. So they started to create a process on when somebody really, when I feel like this situation went really south, I need a process, and I need a trusted person who's not a gossip. It's a just trusted person that's going to support this conversation, and it is going to walk in with me and say, hey, Nola wants to have a conversation with you about something that happened. Do you mind if I mediate that conversation? Do you mind if I'm in the middle and try to help support that? And then they went into a restorative process of restorative conversations where everybody was able to mediate a restorative conversation. And that was, and imagine if police officers were doing that, it'd be amazing.
Oh, I know. Yeah, exactly. And that's honestly the tagline of the podcast for the Janus Oasis is, let's co-create the future of work together.
Co-creation, I love it.
The co-creation really is, how can you keep your people, it's the solution for engagement, it's the solution for advocacy, it's the solution for the future. And it all really comes down to communication and trust. And you can have really hard conversations. You trust that you've got that safe space and you're going to be respected for advancing your opinions.
And it's the only way we're going to move in a positive direction, I would say. Yeah. Even when, you and I were talking, there's a lot of strife happening politically. And I think about my political system in the US and how I feel like a lot of our systems are crumbling, and the co-creation of new systems is the only way to succeed. I don't know if we're going to get there, but that's my hope. I'm very much hopeful that many people are going to be. I'm not the only restorative practitioner out in the world. And my hope is that all the restorative practices people are out there just activated, helping communities repair damage.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. And it's like, how can you shift the perspective from the immediate reaction to optimism? It is what it is. You have to have equanimity that whatever's been happening has been happening. But then how can you shift that perspective? Because as you said, you can't fix what's already passed. You have to work with where you want to go in the future. And what does this look like 5 or 10 years from now? What do you want it to look like? How do you backcast from the future to maybe meet in the middle and get closer to the vision that the majority people want?
Yeah. And really, we all do mostly share the same core values of we really want to be happy and we want our kids to be happy. We want to be safe. We want our kids to be safe.
Yeah.
We want people to self-actualize Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
I was just going to mention it.
And we want to be at that highest level where we can be the exact people that we know we can be in our hearts. And we want all of the systems around us to help support that. And so that's, I think, the ultimate goal. It's the dream, right? But anyway,
and is this what you're covering in your book?
Yeah, the book we talk about workforce emotional climate, which is actually a term coined by my fellow colleague, Dr. Jose Silva. And he really explored that with his research. And then I explored other things, equitable practices in my research. And then my other colleague, Dr. Angelina Duran, she explored the restorative practices more in her research. And so we came together and wrote the book called Fixing Workplace Chaos, Restorative Practices and Leadership. And it's in the editing phase. So I still have time to put in something at the beginning about what's happening now. And it's not out in the world yet published, but pretty soon, probably in the next 2 months, I'll let you know when it launches.
And honestly, that could be good timing. It allows you to settle and just get past the initial shock of the last couple of months. And probably it's good timing. So
yeah, and hopefully it helps people hopefully they read it like a to-do. That's really the whole goal. It's not even just about me. It's about getting this message out there that we can fix and repair. And here is a formula on how to do it.
Exactly. That's right. And there's a way for people with diametrically opposite views to be able to work together to find common ground to make the future a better place where everybody thrives. And that's true, hopefully, for the personal, but also definitely for the business and work.
Thank you, Nola, so much.
You're welcome. Thank you very much for making time. And I wish you well with the book. I'll make sure that we put all your links, your website, LinkedIn. Do you have Twitter?
I do have Twitter. I'll give you my Twitter account. Yeah.
Okay. Yep. We'll put that all in there. And then once your book comes out too, I can add that back in with the launch so that people can find you then. All right. Thank you again.
Thank you, Nola. And you have a wonderful week.
You too. Happy 4th.
Everybody needs to go back and listen to all your other episodes because they're great.
Awesome. Thank you.